Good afternoon to our viewers, at least our viewers in the United States. I can say good afternoon since it's 12:01, and good morning to those in other parts of the U.S. and good evening to those who are around the world. And welcome for today's conversation, Are Sanctions on Russia Working? My name is, I'm Ambassador Richard Morningstar, former ambassador. And I'm the founding chairman of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and formerly have been ambassador to the European Union, among other things. And it's my pleasure today to moderate this discussion. The Atlantic Council Eurasia Center and Global Energy Center are delighted to welcome you to this event to talk about the effectiveness of sanctions implemented on Russia's war machine thus far, and the prospects for expanding sanctions in the future, particularly also with an eye on expanding energy sanctions. We have just a really distinguished panel today to discuss those measures, and I'll introduce them now. Eric Woodhouse, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions, at the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the Department of State. Eric's had a career in the private sector as a lawyer, as well as at Treasury, along with the State Department. Most important, he went to Stanford Law School, where I went and taught for several years. We also have Alexander Sherba, Ambassador Alexander Sherba, who's formerly the Ukraine ambassador to Austria, and he's now the chief advisor to the CEO of Naftogaz. So he'll have important comments on where we ought to be going. Ed Chow, who's a non-resident senior associate at the Energy Security and Climate Program at CSIS. Ed spent many years at Chevron and is an old friend, and looking forward to his comments. Our very own Olga Kakova, Deputy Director for European Energy Security here at the Global Energy Center, who I work closely with, and Dr. Alexander Rodyansky, an Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge, who has been an advisor to the Ukrainian government, also has a PhD from Princeton, and well suited to talk about these issues. A few reminders to the audience. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag #ACEnergy. I might also mention that this event is being carried live on C-SPAN, so if anybody wants to turn on their television. Second, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll try to get to as many as I can. And unfortunately, if you're watching on YouTube, for example, we can't take your questions. We have a large panel and not a lot of time, so we'll move through this as quickly as possible, but as completely as possible as well. So with that, let me introduce Eric, who will deliver opening remarks and then be part of our panel. Eric?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Ambassador Morningstar and the Atlantic Council for inviting me to join today, as well as my fellow panelists. I really look forward to the discussion that we'll have. The opportunity to appear at forums like this is one that's both important to communicating government policy, especially on such pressing matters as those that we'll discuss today, and also engaging with experts such as my fellow panelists today. And I really look forward to a robust discussion. I'm really happy to be here to talk through and share some thoughts on where we are with respect to our response to Russia's further invasion of Ukraine in terms of our use of economic tools. And where we may be going. I just want to acknowledge that the work that you've seen, the measures that we've taken, have really been reflected incredible partnership and a tremendous amount of work by colleagues at the Treasury Department, National Security Council, throughout the State Department, at the Commerce Department when it comes to export controls, and really in addition to that, the incredible partnership that we've had with colleagues around the world, the European Union, European member states, the UK, Japan, and so many others. It's been just incredible to watch from the inside the level of coordination and cooperation and working together to address hard challenges has been really inspiring. So as everyone obviously knows, the United States, along with our partners and allies, has been working hard to degrade Russia's ability to wage war, to help create the leverage necessary to bring President Putin to the negotiating table, and to ensure that the Russian Federation and Belarus pay severe economic and diplomatic prices for their attacks on Ukraine. I think everybody can track specific details about the measures we've taken, and I'm happy to go into more detail on anything in particular in the discussion section. But let me try to pull out some themes that have guided our work. And in particular, I'll highlight three today. We've aimed to impose immediate and severe costs on Russia in response to the invasion. We've aimed to isolate Russia from the international financial system and the global economy. And then we've also aimed to degrade over time the Kremlin's ability to project power. Let me make a couple comments on each of those. On the first objective, to impose immediate and severe costs, I want to highlight in particular our actions targeting the financial sector. This includes not only blocking sanctions and designations of most of the major Russian banks in coordination with counterparts in the European Union and elsewhere, and as well as the European Union's action to remove Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment messaging system, but also actions that we've taken to freeze substantial portions of Russia's hard currency reserves and make them unavailable to the Kremlin as it seeks to support the value of the ruble and otherwise find ways to buffer the impact of our sanctions. We've seen the impact of these actions not only on banks, but in the response that Russia has had to take to safeguard its financial system. And I'll get into more on that later. On the second objective, to isolate Russia from the international financial system and the global economy, I want to comment on the top that the breadth and intensity of the multilateral response to Russia's actions has been critical. It has made clear, our actions, along with actions of partners around the world, have made clear that you cannot do what Russia has done. You cannot so egregiously violate the rules of our international system and continue to benefit from participating in the international financial system, the global economy, and the rules-based order that so many of us have worked so hard over decades to build. On the last point, our objective to degrade the Kremlin's ability to project power, I want to highlight in particular the export control measures that our colleagues at the Commerce Department have led on. These unprecedented measures have cut off much of Russia's access to high-tech imports that are critical to its defense industrial base, as well as other technologically intensive sectors of the Russian economy. And the fact that they've been undertaken in coordination with other major markets supplying these goods, including the full G7, has been exceptionally impactful. We've already seen the impact of these measures. Russia's economy is forecast to contract substantially this year. The Kremlin has had to impose strict capital controls and force exporters to exchange hard currency revenue for rubles in order to support the value of the ruble. And imports are substantially down. I think over time, we're going to see the depth and breadth of these impacts only grow. Lack of access to key inputs, lack of access to export markets, the drawdown over time of financial buffers that may have helped cushion some of this blow, all of those over time will have an increasing impact and undermine the ability of the Russian economy to fully function. I would expect to see ongoing contraction in the Russian economy over time. In terms of what is coming, obviously, I won't be able to get into specifics today, but the bottom line is, as long as Russia continues on its current course, we will continue on our current course. We in the United States, as well as allies and partners around the world, continue to consider options to maintain and expand the pressure as needed in the event that Russia continues on its current course. We obviously hope that at some point that path changes, but I don't think we've seen real signs of that. And so I think for the near term, everyone should expect that we will continue on our course. We will continue to maintain and even expand the scope and intensity of the measures that we've imposed. So let me pause there and look forward to a robust discussion with Ambassador Morningstar and the rest of our panelists. Thank you. You may be on mute still, Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Eric, for your comments. And maybe just to ask you a couple of questions to build on what you've already said, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel. And this relates to maybe one of the last things you said, that President Zelensky told the Financial Times this week that he really doesn't think that Moscow's behavior has been influenced by our sanctions. Maybe other things will influence it, like our supply of arms and so forth. But he did say that sanctions he doesn't think is influencing them. Do you agree with that? And do you think that more can be done that might influence his behavior?
So I think, obviously Russia has continued on its course. President Putin has obviously continued his invasion of Ukraine. In terms of whether sanctions are having their intended impact, I think of that in a few ways. First, we know from looking at the numbers and studying the Russian economy that our sanctions are having an immediate and severe impact on the Russian economy. That's the first step. Are we having an actual impact in Russia? Then over time, I do expect, as I commented, that this effect on the Russian economy is going to intensify and deepen and force Russia to make harder and harder decisions about how much it's willing to endure in terms of its economic isolation from the world. It's in any sanctions program, it's tempting to say, well, we've imposed sanctions and the target of the sanctions has not changed its behavior. But I think that's something that we're going to have to watch over time as this plays out. Sanctions are one tool in a broad diplomatic toolbox that we and partners around the world are using right now, including our diplomatic support, our military assistance to Ukraine, and many other tools that we're using. So the fact that we've not yet been able to change Putin's calculus is obviously critical. That is the conflict we are trying to resolve and end and address. But I think that when it comes to a bottom line in terms of our sanctions having the intended impact, I think it's undeniable they're having an impact, and we're going to have to continue to work towards ensuring that ultimately we're able to bring an end to this conflict through the use of sanctions, but also the full array of other diplomatic tools that we have. And in the end, President Putin and Russia is going to have to make a decision as to how much economic pain and isolation they're willing to endure on this front.
Well, we certainly all hope that it will change his behavior. I'll ask you one more question before going to Ambassador Sherba, and that is, I know you can't tell us what we're going to do. In fact, maybe no decisions have been made as to what we're going to do. But for example, for this morning, inflation numbers came out at 8.6%, and that further sanctions, particularly on oil and gas, could have, and in the U.S. case on oil, maybe more than gas, could have a significant impact. And this is a political year. Without knowing that decisions haven't been made, and certainly you couldn't tell us if they have been, what are the considerations that would be taking place now in determining whether to go further, for example, on oil sanctions, further than Europe has already gone?
Well, thank you. And let me start by saying that, in any sanctions program, the aim is to maximize the intended impact on the target while mitigating and minimizing to the extent possible the impacts to ourselves and to our allies and partners. Obviously, in many situations, we can't fully mitigate or avoid spillover costs to ourselves or to allies and partners. I think the Russia program is a great example of that. I think from the beginning, we here in the United States and allies and partners around the world, particularly in Europe, understood, I think their leaders have been clear about this, that there will be costs, that we will have to take measures and impose costs on Russia that will have spillovers into our own economies. I think what you see Europe working on now in terms of the oil ban that they recently announced, well, with respect to oil arriving in Europe, shipped oil arriving in Europe, shows them tackling those hard questions and willing to accept those costs over time in the interest of reducing their dependence on Russian oil and ensuring that that the flow of European money to Europe is less and less over time. So in the United States, obviously, we're in a different position. Some time ago, the president prohibited the import of Russian oil and LNG and coal, as well as a range of other products. And we were able to do that because of our energy system and the relatively less acute dependence that we have on imports of Russian energy. Europe is in a different position. I think we've seen them doing the hard work to put themselves in a position to make the decision like we've seen this week. And we applaud them for that. It's obviously, we think, the right direction to go. And we've been engaged helping them identify alternative sources and remain in close consultation with them in that process. Obviously, energy is a sensitive issue, not only in Europe, but globally. And I expect that you'll see a sustained effort to find ways to reduce not only, for example, Europe's dependent on Russian oil, but the amount of revenue that's flowing to Russia from its energy sales. But that's something that we're going to have to work on over time.
And I assume this probably will be a simple answer from you, that one of our top priorities is not to do anything that will disturb the unity that is taking place now between us and our European allies.
Certainly the level of partnership that we've seen between the United States and Europe, among G7 countries and others, is in our view critical to the response. I think it sends not only a much more unified message about the international community rejecting Russia's behavior, but it also obviously makes workarounds and evasion much more difficult. It's far more difficult for Russia to avoid or lessen the impact of our sanctions by acting together. So it's obviously something that we prioritize. And I can say the administration has prioritized this coordination with Europe and other partners from day one of the Biden-Harris administration. We've worked very hard to build the relationships, the practices, and the shared confidence needed to consult early, share information, and build measures that we can take together, not only in the Russia context, but in the use of our sanctions and other economic tools more broadly. I think you've seen that in a number of joint actions that we were able to take addressing other situations around the world, even prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And obviously that work served us well when the time came to address Russia's behavior currently.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Ambassador Sherba, who may have some different views, and tell us, Ambassador, what you think of what Europe has done with respect to the oil embargo. What could they do with respect to gas, and what more can the United States do with respect to sanctions? Do you think the United States should go further with respect to oil? So we'd be, or gas for that matter, but be very interested to hear your reactions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for conducting this conference. while working as ambassador in Austria, I always I heard this question over and over again: do sanctions work? Usually, the answer implied was they don't, because Russians are proud people, because sanctions in principle don't work. Pressuring someone into something isn't actually the best way to reach your goals. And instead of that, usually people propose either dropping the sanctions and giving diplomacy another chance, while Putin would give another chance to his, paratroopers and his propagandists and Gazprom. And the second option was, let's, instead of limiting trade with Russia, let's trade even more with Russia, embrace them, show them that we like them. That was the Austrian approach to things. And whatever we earn from that trade, we'll embrace Ukraine from that too, and Ukraine giving more help to Ukraine. So it was extremely naive approach to sanctions. My response usually was that when you introduce sanctions on someone who did something unspeakable, something evil, you do it first of all for yourself, because that's your line between good and evil. That's your decency. And if you don't draw a line between good and evil, then you don't have decency, and then all your speeches in front of United Nations and all your textbooks in school and all the rhetoric about democracy and freedom that are above everything, just empty words. We have been warning, so this is my first point. Of course, now, and I know that you aren't asking this question in the way Austrians were asking it. I see this enormous power and will to counteract, to stop Putin from unspeakable things that he's doing in Ukraine. I see this shock in the world. I see the readiness to do much. And indeed, sanctions have been very wide and very, hard in Russia. I wouldn't go as much as saying crippling. Probably there is a lot of space above and to grow. For instance, only to my knowledge, only 2 out of 10 richest oligarchs in Russia have been sanctioned by the United States. Why being shy? Why don't go further? Or, for instance, my dear colleague, ambassador of Ukraine in Germany, just tweeted before this conference that Germany's trade with Russia beginning of the war grew by 60%. Probably it's largely due to spike in the oil and gas prices, but nevertheless, it's something that doesn't read good. And we should remember that that Putin was getting ready for this war, I think, throughout his whole presidency. Those of us who spoke with Russian people, especially suspected of some connection to FSB, know that at some point between 5th, 6th, or 7th shot of vodka, they would start speaking about something big that was coming upon us, and something that would make Ukraine drop all her hopes for NATO and EU, and to get rid of Russia's shadow. Now we know what they were getting ready for. They were putting aside enormous sums of money. They used Germany's foolishness of when they decided to go absolutely independent from nuclear energy and fully dependent on Russian gas for a couple of years. And of course, they chose this moment to do what Putin was planning to do since years. And because they were getting ready for it, sanctions are not as crippling and as instantly working as we would hope for. But they are working. We know that. We know, especially, I'm a big fan, quite frankly, of personal sanctions, because Russia's relation to the West is a hate-love relationship. On the one hand, they hate the West. On the other hand, the West is where they like to spend their vacations and birthdays and weekends. West is the place where they buy their mansions and plan their future, the future for their children for. So sanctioning personally all decision makers in Russia, their families, their children, that would be enormously important. Sanctioning across the board all the members of Russian propaganda machine would be enormous. In this way, in this domain, the West has huge potential to go forward, and one shouldn't be shy. I heard, well, there were publications in the Ukrainian press that Russian no entry lists for Ukraine was in hundreds of thousands of people. Why not do the same to Russia? Why not do the same to people who make these atrocities in Ukraine possible, even not without participating in them directly? So there is huge space to grow for sanctions, despite everything what has done already. And in the energy field, probably you expect me, first of all, to focus on that. Let me make only one point. My CEO, Yuri Vitrenko, who was visiting Washington the other days, he brought this proposal that I think is very interesting and has a huge potential. He calls it transfer cap. The idea is to let Russia export as much fuel, gas, oil as they want, as long as Germany isn't, or Germany and Eastern and European Union aren't ready to go full embargo. Full embargo is, of course, the ultimate goal. But right now we see they cannot, because of the foolishness of Angela Merkel's decision back in time. They cannot do it right now. So why not introduce a transfer cap, which would be letting Russia bring oil and gas to Europe, paying the contract price, but letting banks and letting off-takers transfer to Russia only a fraction of Russia's revenues, and putting the majority of them on escrow accounts. So this would be not a violation of the contract. This would be not an intrusion on market rules, and this would hurt Russia, and this would make, quite frankly, the situation on global markets a little bit less tense. I would probably end with this, and I'm ready to answer the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. And, you know, a lot of people have brought up the whole, you know, price caps, escrow accounts, and so forth. At least giving my view, I have some doubts about that. I think it would be hard to implement. It would be, you know, whether Russia would play in that game is a serious question mark. And so we'll see what happens. But, you know, with respect to oil specifically, so do you think that the United States should enact an oil embargo similar to what happened with Iran, with secondary sanctions? Maybe the European countries would be exceptions to maintain unity with Europe. Is this something that I know you can't speak for your government, but would you personally advocate that?
Yes, absolutely. So, you know that we Ukrainians, we still, weirdly enough, earn money from transferring gas through our territory from Russia to Europe. Although we are fully for stopping all of this, but we don't want to be look like unreliable partners. But we are absolutely ready to take this pain once the gas embargo is introduced, and once as oil embargo is introduced. I think the United States should go full embargo, should go embargo on secondary exports. Everything that hurts Putin and limits these numbers that are still unfortunately soaring of Russia's revenues from oil and gas trade should be used. Absolutely, it's a very for us it's a simple answer. Probably not as simple for the United States, but I know that today's administration is ready to answer even difficult questions.
And then last thing, and I assume, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I assume that you think that the EU should be doing more on gas than it's presently doing to try and reduce shipments of gas, which is a lot more complicated, frankly, than oil for the Europeans.
Yeah. I still speak a lot to people in Austria, and the country is still on my heart and my mind. Whenever you start speaking about, gas, they look incredibly guilty. They understand that they are financing the most horrible war in the newest history, and everybody is looking forward to this floating LNG platform that Germany is building, and that would give the possibility to buy American LNG instead of, or other LNG or other oil and gas instead of Russian fuels. They are, I think, mentally, emotionally, politically absolutely ready for that step in Europe. Just technically, the readiness is still not there.
Okay, thank you for your very straightforward answers. I think it's time to turn to my old friend Ed, who's known to a lot of us as a good friend and contrarian. And so, Ed, what do you think about, one, the oil embargo? What more should we do? Is it going to have any effect? Is there anything we can do about gas? What about concerns about pushing Russia and China and India closer, and the effects that an oil embargo would have on China and India? Where should we be going, in your view?
Dick, as you said, we've known each other for a long time, and I would hate to disappoint you. So I would
The only thing that's disappointing me is that you're wearing a Golden States Warriors shirt, and I'm a big Celtics fan, and they're in the NBA final.
I did that.
Go ahead.
I did that just for you, actually. As you know, I'm rather limited in my understanding of the world, and so I will try to stick to my competence, which is international.
Yeah, you're talking like the country lawyer, Ed. Come on.
Let me return to the central question posed by the panel, which is, are sanctions on Russia working? If the objective is to stop Russia's unprovoked, totally unjustified, and brutal war against Ukraine, then the obvious answer is no, or at least not yet. I'm afraid the only way of doing that is hard military power along the lines of a no-fly zone enforced by the US or NATO, and Western navies unblocking Russia's naval blockade of Ukraine in order to bring critical material in and Ukrainian food exports out. Since, for reasons that are beyond the competence of this discussion or the scope of this discussion, US and our allies decided against direct military intervention, then economic sanctions become a second best solution to stop Russia's war against Ukraine. However, we should recognize that, what might have taken weeks to achieve militarily will now take many months, if not years. And we should understand the economic and political consequences, both to Ukraine and to ourselves. When it comes to economic sanctions against Russia, energy is the obvious place to look, since it generates half of Russian central government's revenue and the majority of the country's export earnings. But we also need to accept that we cannot restrict exports from the largest exporter of oil and gas combined without serious impact on global markets and therefore price. Crude oil has now risen by more than $30 per barrel since before February 24. International natural gas prices have gone through the roof. Even US natural gas prices at around $9 per million BTU are about 3 times higher than it was last summer. All that is going to flow into the real economy. And this is happening before there is any real reduction in Russian oil and gas exports. The jump in oil prices meant that Russian oil revenue did not suffer, has not suffered, even though it has to offer discounts to move barrels. If the West actually achieves the stated goal of banning Russian oil and gas, then we will see record crude oil prices above $150 per barrel. And we will be looking at not $5 gasoline this summer in the US, but $6. Our policy makers prepared for this? And are they preparing their populations? Or are we somewhat conflicted between wanting to be seen as doing something without accepting the economic consequences of our actions? All along, the target on energy sanctions has been set wrong, in my mind. The objective should be to reduce significantly Russian oil revenue, not volume. It seems the US Treasury Department understood this, but could not dissuade their EU counterparts from announcing an oil ban at the beginning of May, which caused global oil price to rise by $10. I also find Treasury's suggestion of a Russian oil price cap cumbersome and impossible to enforce. The answer, at least my answer, is for the West to impose a hefty oil import tariff on Russian oil. At current prices, I would start with a tariff of at least $50 per barrel, with funds collected dedicated to Ukrainian humanitarian relief and future reconstruction. This would force Russia to increase significantly the price discounts they've had to offer to buyers of Russian oil, Western and non-Western. The damage will be to Russian central government revenue through its collection of export tax, and not to Russian oil producers who will produce as long as the price is above their production costs. No secondary sanctions will be needed against the likes of India, China, Turkey, since the objective is no longer to stop all Russian oil exports, which would severely damage the global economy and strain alliance unity in supporting Ukraine. But the objective would be instead to deprive the Russian government of economic rent from oil exports as much as possible. I really hope that by the time of the G7 and NATO summits at the end of this month, we and our allies would design more effective or smarter oil sanctions rather than risk the sanctions regime unraveling. This starts with a realistic understanding of what energy sanctions can and cannot do in the short to medium term, and what other measures, including hard military power, must be taken if the objective is to stop the war as soon as possible. So did I disappoint you, Dick?
No, not at all, Ed. And I'll just ask, a couple of questions. in theory, I would be fully supportive of what you're talking about. And maybe there's no downside. But my question is two questions. I'm not so sure that Russia would continue to export oil if faced with that situation, or would do so selectively. And then the question is, with countries like India and maybe more particularly China, how do you enforce a tariff structure without secondary sanctions? And could Russia simply get around it by trading with India and China?
We don't have to enforce it on India and China. What we have to do is to do what we already know and have the power to do, which is to impose the tariff ourselves, that is the West. Most Russian oil and gas still goes to Europe. And Russia's already offering $30 per barrel discount to move oil to markets like India and China. And what a tariff would do is to increase the size of that discount to not $30, but $50 or higher. The tariff can also be calibrated depending on conditions, both on the battlefield and in terms of hopefully negotiations on peace. But that would be, I'm talking about taking steps that's within our own power to do without applying secondary sanctions on other countries. Remember, the Iran sanctions started with UN blessing. We don't have the same situation here with Russia sanctions as long as Russia has a veto at the Security Council. So I think sanctions on secondary sanctions on major countries like India and China would be very, very difficult to enforce. We'll find out what the G7 leaders tell Prime Minister Modi when he shows up in Germany for the summit. But what I want to do is have actionable steps that are within the alliance's own power to do, and to do it right now.
So just to make sure that we're clear on this, it sounds to me like you're making two assumptions. One assumption is that Russia's need to export to the West, and maybe we could include Japan and some other friendly countries in this, is so important and so critical that it would be willing to accept the tariff situation and discount prices appropriately, and that there just wouldn't be, and they couldn't just say we're not gonna play in this game because there wouldn't be enough going to India and China or other countries to come close to substituting for what it could lose in the West. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. The reason, as I said, Russia's already offering discounts in the neighborhood of $30 per barrel. The reason you do that from a petroleum industry standpoint is that a barrel that you don't produce today, you produce not tomorrow, but 20, 25 years from now. And the net present value of that is negligible. So, you're talking about a long-term impact, financial impact, and also it would degrade the pressure of the reservoirs so that it's easy, it may not be so easy if you cut production from 11 million barrels per day, which may naturally decline this year to 10 or 9 million barrels per day, but you wouldn't cut it to 5, 6, 7 million barrels per day without damaging the ultimate recoverability of those reserves. So yes, I am counting on Russia being somewhat sensible economically because one, they need the revenue and they don't want to do permanent damage to their petroleum industry.
Okay, I mean, it'll decrease some revenues, whether it would create a behavioral change. I'm not sure, but we better move on because we only have about 15 minutes left, and I would like to get to the audience, although some of what the audience is already asking is covered by what we're talking about now. So we're going to go to Dr. Rodnyansky, then Olga, and then I think Eric should have an opportunity to close out, get his reactions to what's been said. Unfortunately, it's a short session that we have, 1 hour. Dr. Rodnyansky, maybe you could, let's turn to you right now. I know you've been talking about the food crisis, and that you think the food crisis and Russia's reaction is proof that sanctions are working, given that Russia is seeking to basically blackmail the world with respect to food exports. Could you talk a little more about that, where you think we ought to be going, and what you think the impact of the sanctions have been, all of the sanctions, given that the ruble has recovered considerably since February, and is, what does that mean as far as how sanctions are working? So if we could briefly, in a few minutes, have your comments on that, and then I'll turn to Olga.
Yes, well, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me. There's lots of issues that you just mentioned, so I'll try to go through them one by one. But basically, I think when we ask the question, have sanctions been efficient or have they been effective? It's a difficult question to answer because the issues, of course, we don't know what the counterfactual would have been. So the question that we'd like to have answered, what would have happened had there been no sanctions? And we don't observe that outcome, so it's hard to say. But at the same time, we do know from observing what the Russian side has been doing, saying, pushing for behind the curtains in negotiations even before that, and currently saying in public, we do know that sanctions seem to hurt them already quite substantially, even now. And like you mentioned, so I did say that, in fact, they are trying to blackmail the world with a food crisis and asking for the removal of sanctions in return in order to unblock the Black Sea and the ports of Odessa. So that tells you that they do care about it quite a lot, and that it seems to be, exerting severe pressure on their economy, as we know from the numbers also that we're getting. So in that sense, sanctions are working in terms of hurting Russia's economy, hurting income. There's income growth. Obviously, there's a steep recession in Russia, as we know, somewhere between 12 and 15%, according to projections this year, in terms of the GDP fall. But sanctions have not been enough in order to stop the war. So that has been just said by the previous speaker, Edward Chow, and I completely agree with that. So in this sense, I'm not sure whether military force was ever an option against Russia, realistically speaking, because obviously Russia is a nuclear power, which it keeps reminding everyone of more recently. And I can, in some sense, we have to be fair that it would be hard to envisage, military force to be the first method to be used in that case. However, it doesn't mean that sanctions were always futile in terms of their capacity to stop the war. I don't think so. I think had sanctions, or if sanctions could have been, absolute in terms of the energy embargo, for example, then Russia would have already had very severe, a very severe crisis and real difficulties financing the war effort continuously. So we know that, for example, somewhere around, if we count the direct and indirect revenues that go into Russia's budget from energy sales, and it's basically more than 50%, somewhere around 55% that stems from that. If that were to fall away instantaneously, then Russia would have a very severe balance of payments, fiscal problem, and it would definitely find it very hard to keep up the war effort. We even know from other, anecdotal evidence, if you want, or direct evidence, that the Russian side is now promising substantial salary increases and compensation increases to soldiers to go and fight in Ukraine. So that tells you that the monetary stimulus is vital for them even now, because morale is very low. The soldiers are obviously unwilling to go there, and they haven't been very successful. So the Russian side still has the capacity to use monetary stimuli to keep up the war effort. And obviously, if they didn't have the financial capacity to do that, then they wouldn't be able to keep up the war effort. So that's very simple logic. And I think in that sense, there hasn't been enough done. And even though this is a very potent instrument that could be used. So that's what I would say. Regarding your other question, about the ruble and the exchange rate. So here it's actually also a consequence, perversely enough, the fact that the ruble has strengthened is somewhat a consequence of the way that sanctions have been imposed. They have been basically primarily been imposed on Russia's imports, that is exports to Russia, as has been mentioned already, not so much on Russia's exports, which is the energy part that we just spoke about. And this creates a situation where there's essentially lower demand for foreign currency in Russia, but still ample supply of rubles and dollars through the energy sales, which they are then using to support their own currency. So remember that even though the central bank has been sanctioned, Gazprom Bank and Gazprom itself, if you want, has become sort of a shadow bank in Russia now. They are using the revenues that they're generating and the currencies that they're then getting, and they're selling a lot of them to support their own ruble, their own currency. So that's what's happening on one side. And in order to, so the conclusion from that is, in order to weaken the ruble, you would actually have to hit Russia's exports, and then that means primarily energy exports. And another reason that's been what you already mentioned, or some of the speakers have mentioned, is that there have been substantial capital controls and foreign exchange controls that were introduced. It's very hard to convert currencies now. It's very hard to use to have even dollar accounts in Russia now. And basically, they have also limited the amount of demand that people can have for foreign currency or dollars in Russia through that way, and therefore converting into dollars. So that has also been effective in helping support their currency. But yes, it is a sign that, first of all, sanctions haven't been sufficient, and also that even though Russia's economy is in a steep crisis, it's far from over. It's far from collapsing, and therefore we do see what we see. But that doesn't mean that things are going too well. It's just the way, the fact that the ruble has strengthened is just a reflection of the way sanctions have been imposed and the way that the Russian side has responded to it through capital control, foreign exchange controls. So that's what I will say.
Good. Just very briefly, because we need to move to Olga as time is moving on. I take it, you mentioned Gazprom Bank, that Russia's insistence on payment in rubles for gas is having a marginal impact, given that companies are going to Gazprom Bank and exchanging, if I'm right, exchanging Western currencies for rubles there. I wouldn't say much ado about nothing, but not having a huge effect. Is that correct? So I'll ask if that's correct. And also, knowing you, I know you're part of Mike McFall's group, which I'm also part of. So I take it that if you were asking the US to do something, that you would support some kind of global oil embargo. And gas being a little more difficult, would have to work through. So very, very briefly, am I right on both of those questions that I'm asking you?
So the first question, I think you're basically right. I mean, it was always somewhat puzzling to the Western partners, why the Russian side demanded that, because, I mean, markets did react to it initially. The ruble somewhat strengthened back then when Russia put out that demand, but not too much, because ultimately, like I said, they are using the foreign currency revenues then to convert and to support the ruble. But also, I think what was really central for them was to kind of make sure or create a situation where the West would be undermining their own sanction regime by paying in rubles, essentially, and somehow make it very uncomfortable for the West to, basically continue their own sanction regime through that. So it's not necessarily clear why, what the big gain is from that. But so I agree with that part. But there's other aspects that they've probably been counting on. So, and as far as the second question is concerned, yes. So, I mean, of course, I mean, the big elephant in the room is everything that has to do with energy in the case of Russia, as I said, simply because that's the lion's share of their budget revenues that come from that. And if we were to take that away, even though that's very hard to do for the obvious reasons, then we would, undermine Russia's ability to finance the war. And that would almost be, the first best solution, I would almost say, perhaps even better than military force. But that is an abstract scenario. We can't obviously do that for the obvious reasons, and Europe is not willing to do that for the obvious reasons. But that's somewhere where we should, aim to get relatively soon. So I would support that. I actually, I have a question myself. I was listening to Edward Chow, and there's this discussion about whether you should impose an import tariff or a price cap. From an economic perspective, is almost isomorphic. It's very similar in terms of the effect it would have on limiting Russia's surplus revenues or profits. Perhaps there's some political aspects why you would prefer one versus the other. But it would definitely, in that sense, it's very similar for us. So my question would be actually, why Edward Chow thought it was better or more realistic to do that. But otherwise, yes, the short answer is yes. It needs to happen.
Okay, Ed, in 30 seconds, can you answer that?
The answer is that an import tariff is completely within the control of Western governments, and a price cap would affect enforcing it on other countries. And so it's as a practical matter, it's much easier to implement a import tariff than a price cap. How are you going to enforce that on Brazil and South Africa, never mind India and China?
Well, you'd have difficulty enforcing a tariff on those countries as well.
No, they don't need to have a tariff. They would enjoy the discount that Russia would be forced to provide.
Okay, we could probably debate this for a long time, but we better move on. And I'm going to go to Olga now. And Olga, very briefly, unfortunately, talk a little bit about Europe. What do you feel about the embargo? You've talked about a reduce, reroute, and a reserve strategy to de-Russify Europe's gas supply. Could you explain that a little bit? And basically tell us what you think about what Europe is doing and where it ought to be going. And unfortunately, in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll keep this brief. I think Repower EU plan that was recently launched is a really great example of how EU is observing this strategy to reduce reliance on Russian energy imports. Part of this is tackling the demand side. Part of this is building out renewable energy sources, and of course, additional infrastructure that could support diversified energy supplies. I think there are some lessons learned from the oil embargo, from the oil sanctions in the 6th package, even though it wasn't 100%. I think there's some lessons learned there that we can take as we start thinking about what a ban on natural gas, a full or partial, could look like. The fact that some countries that are landlocked and had a harder time with this significant change in our energy systems, I think we can take a look at what kind of concessions would have to be made for natural gas in order to get something across the line, and what's feasible while also maintaining European energy security, figuring out how US and other partners can support this. I think it's also really important to send signals from both European side and the US side in terms of what kind of infrastructure is actually needed in order to reroute 140 BCM a year. We've also seen in the last several years going up to 175, 200 BCMs coming from Russia. That is a significant amount, and there will be some additional infrastructure that will be needed. So sending those signals to investors that are looking at longer-term plans, longer-term contracts, and providing some confidence there will be extremely important. I think also, just going back for just a second in terms of is there impact right now? Putin has recently said in one of his interviews that Russia needs to, Russia will have there will be a better life, or I can't remember his exact words, but the quality of life or something will improve in 10 years. So he's already giving his people this 10-year timeline. I mean, he's already preparing the nation that's already extremely uncomfortable and is feeling these sanctions to say, okay, strap in for another 10 years. And who knows what's going to happen in 10 years. So he's asking these people to trust him that things will improve in 10 years, that this is worth the suffering. So I think, once again, just to reiterate what the other panelists were saying, the end goal is the most important. It's to reduce Russia's revenues that they're making from oil and gas. And then the second part of that is to reroute those revenues, whatever is left over, to help Ukraine rebuild and to support families who have been, and cities who have been hurt with this terrible war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I wish we had more time to talk about Europe's strategy, and maybe we'll be having another session. But thank you, Olga. We have just a minute, 2 minutes or so left, and so Eric, you've been listening to this. What's your reaction? And you can make closing remarks.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks to all the panelists today for what I think was really a great discussion. I mean, I can come back to one of the points I made in the beginning, which is we in the United States and our partners and allies are committed to continuing to maintain and deepen our pressure on Russia as long as it maintains its current course. That includes targeting Russia's export revenues from energy. We've heard a number of ideas here. I can assure you that we continue to develop ideas within the U.S. government. We listen and we take in ideas from discussions like this and outside experts like this, and work those internally as well. So we really welcome this input and hearing different ways to do this that we could maybe develop further. But I just want to end by saying that the urgency that we feel to continue making progress to ending this conflict is as intense today as it was at the end of February. So not only on this front in terms of our economic response and the economic pressure that we're bringing to bear on Russia, but across the range of our response to this awful and tragic and unprovoked invasion, from our diplomatic response to our support to Ukraine and everything else. The urgency within the U.S. government is palpable and as powerful today as it was in late February, and that's gonna continue as long as it needs to.
That's great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you for your great participation. Also, thank you to the panelists. You've all been terrific. This has been a very important discussion, and I apologize for rushing you through. We just haven't had, we just didn't have the time to be more thorough. And I also apologize to the extent I was asking some leading questions, I guess, maybe to move things along more quickly. But you did a phenomenal job, and we really appreciate it. I want to thank both the Eurasia Center and the Global Energy Center for their help in putting together this event. I might also mention our Geoeconomic Center also has a sanctions dashboard that you can find on our website. Specifically, I want to thank Patty Ryan, Andrew Danieri, Will Tobin, Rebecca Meacham-Nance, Doug Klain, Jasper Gilardi, Graham McGillivray, and Jackson Styron for their help in putting this together. I hope you'll join us on Tuesday for the 7th Annual Central and Eastern European Energy Security Conference. And again, this presentation is available on our website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please share it. And thank you. And I think I've gotten through all of the necessary things that I'm supposed to tell you. So thank you, and see you next time.